Hi there, this is Iris from Iris Makes, and this time I'm going to show you how to make your own knitted pumpkin. So first of all, we need to select a needle size 1mm smaller than the recommended needle size for your yarn that you're using. And the reason for this is that you don't want your pumpkin to be too gappy when it's all stuffed up. So just use a smaller needle size than you normally would for the yarn. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is cast on 42 stitches using a long tail cast on method. Start the long tail cast on by making a slip knot. Start by pulling the slip knot tight and placing it onto your needle. The working yarn attached to the ball of yarn should be at the back and your yarn tail at the front. Now set up for the long tail cast on by wrapping the working yarn around your little finger and index finger and the yarn tail around your thumb. Using the needle, you will then go underneath the first piece of yarn on your thumb, pull this over the other piece of yarn coming from your thumb, grab the yarn on your index finger and pull this through the gap made between the two pieces of yarn coming from the thumb. Pull it tight and there you have your first stitch. Once you've cast on your stitches, make sure you go back and count that you really do have 42 stitches. As the first slip knot actually counts as a stitch, you can often get confused. Once you're happy that you have 42 stitches, make sure your yarn tail is at one side and your working yarn is at the other side of your piece. You're now going to start knitting in the round. Make sure your cast on stitches are not twisted. Place a stitch marker on the right hand needle and then proceed to knit the first stitch on the left needle, making sure you use the working yarn and not the yarn tail. Then knit a further 5 stitches and purl 1. Knit 6, purl 1 until the end of the round, and continue to do this until you're happy with the size of your pumpkin. Before finishing the first round, make sure you have 6 knit stitches separated by purl ridges. Continue knitting in the round until your piece measures about twice as long as it is wide. If you want a slightly shorter pumpkin, you can knit less rounds. If you want a more rounded pumpkin, you can knit more rounds. Once you're happy with the size of your piece, get yourself a darning needle and pair of scissors. Cut the yarn, leaving a very long tail, which you'll need later. Then with a darning needle, thread the yarn tail through the remaining live stitches. You can then remove the knitting needles and pull the hole tight using the yarn tail. Next up, we're going to stuff the pumpkin full of stuffing. So for this, you can either use a toy stuffing, or here I'm using fabric scraps. However, make sure if you're using fabric scraps or any other stuffing that the colour of the stuffing matches the colour of your pumpkin, as this will shine through a little bit through the knit stitches. So what I did is I used a layer of white fabric and then stuffed my coloured fabric on the inside. So again, use your darning needle to thread the yarn tail from the cast on edge through the cast on stitches and pull this tight to close the hole. Make sure you close this quite tight using a couple of knots and threading the end. Now we're ready to form the shape of the pumpkin. So go back to your other side of the pumpkin with the long yarn tail. Again, thread the tail through into your darning needle And first, make sure you close the hole with some knots and keep it really nice and tight. Next, we're going to thread this yarn tail through the ridges created by the pearl stitches. And by pulling this tight, we will pull these inwards and make the lobes of the pumpkin. In order to secure these yarn ends, make sure you go through a couple of stitches here and there just to guide the yarn where it's supposed to go. Make sure you're careful if you're using a unspun yarn or a delicate yarn that you don't pull too tight and snap the yarn like I did here. Don't worry if you do snap the yarn, just tie it back together and continue. You can always hide the yarn ends from the tied bit inside the pumpkin at the end. Repeat this process by going across all 6 ridges of the pumpkin until you get a nice pumpkin shape. Sometimes you might have to give it a good squish and move the stuffing around a bit to get the shape that you want. Once you're happy with the shape of your pumpkin, make sure you tie off the ends nice and tightly and cut off any remaining yarn tails. Next, we're going to make the stem. So you have 2 options here. You can either make a stem out of a contrasting yarn using an I-cord method, or you could use a cinnamon stick if you're not comfortable with the I-cord, or you don't have any extra yarn lying around. Here I'm making an I-cord stem using a darker coloured yarn. Again, I'm using a knitting needle about 1 size smaller than the recommended needle size for the yarn. I cast on 4 stitches and make a short I-cord. Once you're happy with the lengths of the stem, cast off all the stitches and cut the working yarn. To give the stem a nicer shape, I use a darning needle to thread the cast off end of the yarn tail back through the tube of the I-cord. When you pull this tight, this curves the stem over a little bit to give it more of a natural look. Once you've got the stem looking how you'd like it to look, you can tie the 2 yarn ends together to keep the shape. Next, you'll attach this I-cord stem to the pumpkin. There's no real method for this, just attach it as neatly as possible and cut the yarn tails. You can either leave the yarn tails exposed to give a kind of more rustic look to the pumpkin, or you can thread these inside into the stuffing of the pumpkin using a crochet hook. And that's it. You've made your own knitted pumpkin.